Hello, and welcome back again to another edition of Science Baraza, where, as you know, we ensure that we're able to demystify what may seem to be complex science issues in words and into ways in which you can consume them and understand them. We're extremely privileged to have with us Dr. Rose Mwebaza, who is the Regional Director for Africa at United Nations Environment Programme, running out of Nairobi here. Dr. Rose, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. So, wow. I think there's so much that we could probably ask you, and we'll probably have to bring you back into another episode. But for this particular episode, would like to know, tell us a little bit about your role and the role of UNEP and Africa in COP28 this year.
So, as you said, I'm the director for Africa in UNEP, and I'm also the regional representative now. Those two titles matter. Internally, I manage the Africa office. Externally, I'm the regional representative, so the equivalent would be UNEP's diplomatic representative for the African member states. And so within that role, my principal responsibility is working with the African member states to perform several functions. One, to mobilize resources for environmental action. In UNEP, there are many crises in the world today, really, and I think this year they've become exponential. But in UNEP, we've decided to focus on three crises. We call them the triple planetary crisis. We are dealing with climate, nature, and pollution. So I work with colleagues across the house to raise money for Africa on climate, nature, and pollution. And it's a large portfolio. It's over $1 billion and counting of the resources we raise from the Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund, and several other funds across the world, but also multilateral and bilateral funding from largely developed countries in the north. And then I also play the diplomatic part of convening Africa for global environmental processes. And right now, the principal ones that I will focus on for purposes of our conversation, I convene the Africa Group for negotiating under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. I convene the Africa Group for negotiating under the Convention on Biological Diversity. And the latest that is being dubbed the Paris Agreement, the equivalent of the Paris Agreement is the International Treaty on Plastics that we are negotiating. I also convene and mobilize Africa and provide the technical support that Africa needs to negotiate on a global platform.
Great. I love the term negotiate and convening. So one of the things we like to do here is demystify what may seem to be very complex terms. So when you say that, who are the negotiators and what do they do? And when you say you convene, why are these convenings important, if they are important?
The convenings are very important, and I tell people, they are not as glamorous as people think. There's actually a lot of hard work that goes into it. I will use the latest example of the biggest gathering that we've had, the UNFCCC, as we call it, COP. All multilateral environmental agreements have COPs, but the climate change COP seems to be a big COP these days. And I learned in the Arab language, they call it the big gathering, a majlis, when they gather. In South Africa, they call it the Indaba. So when we're actually meeting in Dubai, they created this big meeting room that looked like a tent in the Arab desert where you sit.
I did see it. It was beautiful. I saw the roof.
It's very beautiful, regardless of title or religion or background. You just sit and discuss honestly and openly. What do we do to stop the planet from literally catching on fire or frying? The plan, when we agreed on the 1.5 degrees in the Paris Agreement, was to work towards that. Several years later, we are way beyond. And the science tells us we are on a trajectory over 2 degrees. Now, these numbers mean nothing when we tell them to people. What it means is what you see in your countries or homes where you are.
Exactly.
The frequent rains that come at unexpected times, heavy, devastating and destructive with floods and landslides, which are followed by shocking dry spells that lead to droughts and famines. or in other parts of the world, the level of flooding where hundreds of people die. It happens even in our regions. So climate change is not something futuristic. It is something we are living with, and so we have reached now the threshold of where we should be going. And so that convening, because we've all contributed to polluting, the reason climate change is a problem is we've polluted the atmosphere so much with these carbons. That's why we call it carbon emissions. They are destroying the atmosphere. It means the rate at which the atmospheric pressure is affecting life on the planet, not just humans, but everything that we know on Earth. And how do you get 200 countries to agree what to do? Because everybody is doing something that is contributing to the problem.
Yes.
And that is why we need that gathering. So I convene the Africa group for that gathering, led by the Ministers of Environment. So we call it in short AMSEN, the Africa Ministerial Conference on Environment. This Conference of Ministers reports to the Committee of Heads of State and Government, CAHOS. We like acronyms in the UN.
Yes, that's good.
And then they are supported by a brilliant team of experts who are the Africa Group of Negotiators. So we convene those three categories, and then we provide the science, the technical support, because UNEP produces the emissions gap report, the adaptation gap report, the production gap report, and also the IPCC. So we produce the core of the science that tells us the state of environment globally, how we're polluting the environment, how we're destroying nature and climate, and what we need to do, most importantly, to put it all together.
Dr. Mwebaza, one of the things I'd like you to probably unpack for us, and especially for Africans and more so for those living in the global south, how serious are these problems, and do our negotiators really have any power, and is there any outputs that we can say that they have successfully achieved?
It's a very serious problem. I will start with where we are. UNEP is the only global UN entity that is located in the south, in an African country. It's something that Africa should be proud of. It is something that Africa is proud that the Kenyan government saw fit in 1972 to put in a bid. It's a very competitive process. Most of the UN agencies are in Europe or in North America, so for us to have a global UN entity is not a small thing. And so for what we do here in UNEP, and for how, whether we really do anything that is impactful.
Yes.
I will start with Kenya, where we are. That's why I started with that preamble.
Right.
We all know what has been happening. Yes. Extreme droughts we had last year.
We did.
I remember at the time of the COP last year, being in Sharm el-Sheikh with President Ruto, and then leaving Sharm el-Sheikh with the Executive Director of UNEP, Inge Anderson, and flying off to northeastern Kenya because there was a ravaging drought.
Yes, it had about 4 years of drought.
Livestock,
that is true.
Dying.
Yes.
Now, the same time this year, they're devastating floods.
In fact, the very same areas that you went to
that
are now
climate
totally
change in its manifestation.
Right.
So when we tell people it is not something, scientists are fictitiously making up,
yes,
that is why we call it extreme weather events. It's not normal that the same area could have devastating, droughts 4 years in a row, and then devastating
rains.
Devastating floods.
Great. I think now we've got some context. So what and how is it that the work that you do and that your negotiators do and that the African countries do is important to the very same people that you flew into those areas, so that they can understand why it is and it's important that we're having this conversation today?
It is extremely important what our negotiators do, and the ministers and the heads of state. Because, again, to give the example of the extreme weather events that are causing extreme loss and damage, loss of life and property, including livestock, and damage. One of the things that Africa led the negotiations on, and we really need to give credit to our ministers and negotiators, are what they've been lobbying for, what we call the Loss and Damage Fund. We've been negotiating over that for a long time to deal precisely with the kinds of conditions I've been explaining that happen in northeastern Kenya. And the argument was that there is simply no way for certain countries and communities to deal with the impacts of climate change. So the global community must come together because this is a global problem, put together a fund that collects money that supports these communities. And this fund was agreed on and established at COP28 in Dubai, and with a startup capital of 700 million. It's not a small achievement. One, negotiating a mechanism among 100 member states to agree to say that yes, we shall do something to countries like Kenya, Malawi, Mozambique, the entire Sahel region, literally everywhere in the world, but I'll just stick to Africa. And then to capitalize it. Of course, the idea is to capitalize it to the billions of dollars. But this is a great achievement, and this is something African negotiators negotiated day and night. I tell people it's not glamorous, contrary to the beautiful buildings you see, and all those wonderful gentlemen in suits and women. They stayed up, the first negotiations, it's up to 2 a.m. in the morning. And so it's a great achievement. That money comes and it does help. The other great achievement, because these communities need money to relocate, to restock, to restart their lives. So the other fund that was recapitalized, that is very important to these communities, is the Green Climate Fund, $3.5 billion, which brings it to around 13.8, just under $14 billion. That money is going to come to countries.
Will the countries be able to draw down from them? Because I think the biggest problem has always been that apparently there's always this money that we hear about, but there's no mechanism or nobody's drawing down from it. So,
and that is the other part. I think climate finance was one of the most hard negotiations. On the last day, people didn't sleep people stayed up the whole night until 5 a.m. And then they started meeting again at 9, because that was precisely the idea. The Africa Group's argument was that we love the World Bank and the IFC and all those big multinational financial institutions, but accessing finance is difficult. But it comes as loans. For countries that are dealing with excessive loss and damage from extreme weather events caused by climate change, they don't have money to pay back loans, they need grants. So the Loss and Damage Fund, the Green Climate Fund, is established precisely to be outside the loan commercial mechanism so that countries can get this money and it comes directly to support them. So it was a hard-fought, hard negotiated outcome, and I will tell you why. It was fractious because the conversation on climate change, as you know, started off. Africa really has not contributed to the problem.
That is true.
That was suffering the most.
We're suffering the most from it, yes.
And so to be able to convince the countries in the global north that have historically been responsible to put up billions of dollars, it was a very hard fight. And that is where I say that to most people it's like, they flew off to Dubai with the lights and cities. No, they negotiated substantive outcomes on how the global north can bring some of that money they used to industrialize and pollute the global commons to come and solve the problem they've created in our countries.
So I want to take a little bit away from Dubai and back into Kenya. UNEP, as you've said, is headquartered here in Nairobi. One of the biggest asks and cries by the Kenyans has been that they do not feel the effect of what the agency is actually doing in country. Maybe you can make some remarks around that.
Oh, we do. It's such a pity, though, because Kenya, as the host country, of course, benefits the most. You remember in the beginning, I told you that part of what we do is mobilize resources.
Yes.
Hundreds of millions of dollars from the Global Environment Facility, the Green Climate Fund, coming into Kenya through various ministries. So in fact, it's hundreds, literally, of millions of dollars. And it's such a pity that this is not felt, so we probably need to do a little bit more. But the government knows that we do this. But I think the other extended impact of having a global institution in a country like Kenya that most people probably, I don't know if they pay attention to, is the macroeconomy it creates. The number of meetings that are held annually and that compound. Oh, the number of people, 2,000 families, not individuals. They are all living in this country. Everybody pays rent, everybody shops in the supermarket, goes to Mama Mboga, everybody. Nobody comes to Kenya and doesn't love ugali and chapati and mandazi. Their kids go to school here. So it really creates a large macroeconomy that contributes significantly. But most importantly, it also creates tourism opportunities, because everybody who comes, wherever they come from in the world, agrees hands down, and Kenyans must be proud, it's a beautiful country. Nairobi is a beautiful city, the only city with a game park. So everybody's getting everybody to come in. So a large chunk of the tourists who come are families and friends, word of mouth of UN employees or people who come for meetings. Everybody who comes stays another 3 or 5 days. So the extended impact of having the UN in Nairobi cannot be underestimated. Next year, in February, we are going to have the United Nations Environment Assembly. It's the biggest assembly in the world. Thousands of people, literally. Every hotel will be full in the city. Every Airbnb will be full. And we know from experience, when we were meeting with both the Cabinet Secretary for Environment and Cabinet Secretary for Foreign Affairs, that the majority of these people go on to stay to do some tourism, because you hit two birds with one stone. You get some business done, you stay and have some pleasure. They go to the Masai Mara, they go to the coast. So to say that the work that we do supporting the environmental journey of this country, but also the extended impact. And I think the last year has been particularly good for us in UNEP, with the Kenyan president also being the head of the Committee of Heads of State and Government on Climate Change. The leadership he brought is unprecedented. The Africa Climate Summit is unprecedented. Its impact didn't stop just in Nairobi. He went on to play a critical role in the negotiations on climate finance. And to go back to the issue of finance, because that is where the rubber meets the road. Our people need money to extricate themselves from the ravages of these extreme weather events. We need to renegotiate not just new funds, but also the debt payment structure. If a quarter, some countries pay almost half of their GDP goes to servicing debt, how are they going to help communities that are suffering from floods or droughts? So that also has to be renegotiated. The rich countries that contributed to the global warming that is leading to climate change are also the ones that are taking back all this interest on the loans. So maybe they shouldn't be taking that money back. If you can imagine, if all the money that went to debt servicing in Kenya, in Uganda, in Zambia, in Ghana, in all the other countries went supporting communities that were dealing with climate change, it would make a huge impact. So those are some of the conversations that our leaders have, and they do make a big impact.
Great. If you're watching, this is Science Baraza, and today our guest is none other than Dr. Rose Mwebaza. She's the Regional Representative and Regional Director, Africa at UNEP, and we hope that you're also following us on our social media platforms, and do give us your comments so that we can get your input and be able to feedback in our other upcoming programs. Now back to you. People who are watching this, we've got a very eclectic audience that actually engage with us, and a lot of people are seeing that here is a lady of African descent who's at a very top position, and a lot of them are asking themselves, we've never heard of Dr. Rose Mwebaza before. How did you get here? Because a lot of people are interested in probably taking the same journey and also acquiring and maybe working within the same places that you work in. So maybe a bit of background on that.
That's a very important background. We would really like to see many more people who look like me from the African continent into the UN. The UN works on the basis of geographical representation. And right now, the member states, the other thing they are pushing for that people don't know is to see more Africans in the system, people like me. It's also a negotiated outcome, because we know the more of us there are on the table. I mean, my colleagues in the UN are absolutely brilliant scientists and economists and lawyers and whatever else they do. But as I always tell people, that when it is someone like me working for the UN and working for Africa, it is professional, but it's also personal. Because as you said, I am an African woman, born and bred. So the things I talk about, I don't have to read.
Exactly.
They're lived experiences.
The lived experiences.
Yeah.
Absolutely,
So when people say, "Oh my God, you're so passionate," it's like, yes, I know what I'm talking about.
Because this is
my
home.
People.
They're your people.
Yeah.
We are your people.
My people, I know this is where I come from.
Yes.
And I think that is also a privilege, because you speak from a place of authenticity and of knowledge. And I think that really drives my passion. But to the point of how did I get here? I mean, there are no two ways about it. The UN is absolutely a competitive place to get in, because as the name suggests, it's the United Nations. For every position that's put out, it's broadcast around the world to all the member states. So the number of people who apply are simply many, because of the nature of the organization.
Absolutely, yes.
So it's an absolute privilege to be able to go through the assessment process to get where I am. So what does that require? You need a lot of preparation to get to these positions. You need a lot of resilience and a lot of hard work. We have a lot of smart Africans. I think especially in the last 3 decades, the number of Africans who are highly educated and have gone to college is high. But we also need a lot of other skills that need to go with that great education. And we need a lot of resilience. These jobs, they do come with a huge responsibility. As I tell people, it's not as glamorous. The meeting rooms may look glamorous, but it's a lot of hard-fought negotiations.
Absolutely, yes.
And it's a lot of commitment. I tell people, it is negotiations, because we are at that point in our evolution as humans where we use our words. We are trying so hard to move away from fighting, brawn. We use our brains, not our brawn.
Exactly.
So it's even harder to get intelligent people from 200 countries to negotiate. So, yeah, it takes a bit of work.
We'll almost come to the end of the program. One of the things I'd like to ask you, as Rose Mwebaza, and to our viewers who are watching, and to the ordinary person who's watching, what things should we be doing as our own individuals so that we're able to probably mitigate the challenges that we're having within the climate change environment today?
That is really important, because as I said somewhere in our conversation, that climate change is no longer a futuristic thing. In the beginning, our scientists, when they made the first estimations in the IPCC, they would say in the year 2100, but we now know with the advancement in technology, we can determine with precision of 100% when the next event is going to occur. So it is now. And so each of us has to do something. So starting in the way we manage our land, there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge in the African practices of land management and managing the resources around us, the ecosystems, the forests, the wetlands, the kind of things that Wangari Maathai did. Gigiri, where the UN is one of the most beautiful places in Nairobi because of Karura Forest. Why do we have Karura Forest? Because one Kenyan woman, one of who inspires me the most, Wangari Maathai, did the simple act of planting trees and ensuring that trees don't get cut. So what can we do individually? Manage our natural resources better. As Africans, we have a lot of knowledge and wisdom in how we manage our land, how we follow it, how we irrigate it and make sure we maintain the resources, because the climate has changed. 2, you have to work with our governments. It's a problem on a monumental scale. If you look at the droughts or the floods, whichever it is, our governments need to plan better. When I have meetings, even our governments are also actually a little bit flabbergasted. We tell them the way you used to build roads 20, 15 years ago, is not the same. It's either too hot or too cold.
Right.
So your engineers need to rethink and relearn everything they knew, or the way we used to grow food. The seasons are short, they don't last long, the rains don't last long, or they're too much. So we have to think how we plan for agriculture, how we grow food, and ensure food sovereignty. A hungry nation is not a secure nation. It goes to the core of the dignity of the people in that country. So these are things we must think about individually, but also collectively, because it must also be done at national level. But there are also simple things, because the more resources we use, the more pollution there is. Do you have to have on all the lights in your house all the time? You know, simple things like that. Do you have to buy everything? There's a high consumerism in the world. And for Africa, because we are a young continent, young, highly educated, aspirational population, we've taken on the consumerism of the global north that caused this problem. So we also have to think, how did we live in Africa? We shared everything, actually. In the global north, people are talking about 15-minute communities where everybody lives together, and all the services they need in that community. I said, we have bombers. We lived in bombers and communities in Africa. That's why we said it took a village. We lived in a community. We didn't drive 100 miles, so there was no big four-wheel guzzlers, you know, killing the environment. So the concept of living together, Ubuntu, is coming back in a Western way. And so we have to think about all those things. We used to share clothes, my siblings and I. It was very okay, but must every child have a new set of clothes every time? And I would be very happy to get the hand-downs. I would be waiting to take the dress from my sister and my younger siblings. It's a simple thing, but it also creates community, actually. So there's this whole new, there's so many movements coming up now of people reusing, recycling. But in fact, it's an African upcycling. It's something we did in Africa.
We've always done that, yes, yeah.
We've always done that. So can we individually and as communities tap into? That is the wisdom that the world is now going to. But it is really African. Recycling is an African thing. Upcycling, reusing, living together and sharing resources. The so-called 15-minute communities, and I think Barcelona has perfected that. But it's actually an original African concept, how we live in our bombers and share resources. So, yeah.
So seriously, one of the things that we're doing as Alliance for Science coming up next year is definitely tapping into traditional knowledge. That is one of the very key things that we're going to be working on. So I'm really happy and I'm smiling here as you say this, because it essentially shows that we've thought this through and we are heading in the right direction. Now, just to wind up, what do you want to tell viewers who would probably come across this 100 years from today?
100 years from today, I really hope that our grandchildren will say we did the best. Because the truth of the matter, without being alarmist, if we don't do what we are required to do, we are going to destroy the planet. And what keeps me awake before I tell you what I would like our ancestors, one of the books I love to read is The Good Ancestor. How can we be good ancestors? Is that when our children look back, they should be able to say we did the best. And my greatest fear is that we will wait too late to do what is required to save the planet. And that is a real fear. But what really gives me hope is human ingenuity. I tell people humans have survived where dinosaurs and other fierce creatures didn't. Why? Because we are adaptive. We intuitively know when we need to do something to change. We are innovative. We are intelligent, and the rate at which we are harnessing technology and innovation has the potential to really help us overcome this. And additional to that, as I said, is for us now, speaking as an African, our indigenous knowledge and understanding, the way we lived, the way we used and shared resources. Because consumption and production, the excessiveness of it is also one of the reasons we have this problem. So going back to those values where we used and shared and reused, recycled and upcycled, and where we lived, with our communities, being considerate of each other, because we've also become very individualistic. We've lost that sense of Ubuntu. So I think those values, if we can bring them back to our society and then harness the power of innovation, of technology. So I'm hoping that our children 100 years from now will say, they averted a catastrophe. And that is why we still can live on this beautiful planet.
Thank you very much. This has been Science Baraza, where you get to meet the most acclaimed scientists and professionals that speak on matters of science and are able to simplify them into terms and ways in which you can understand and consume. Thank you for watching, and until next week, goodbye.